We gave Miriam the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's the highest award you can get as a civilian. It's the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, but civilian version. It's actually much better because everyone gets the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's soldiers. They're either in very bad shape because they've been hit so many times by bullets, or they're dead. She gets it, and she's a healthy, beautiful woman. It's right. And they're rated equal.
Welcome back to the Magnolia Media Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. And well, folks, you heard it there. Donald Trump is once again denigrated American service members, especially those who receive the Medal of Honor posthumously after death, or those who have been gravely wounded and will never completely heal from the bullets they absorbed. And somehow that is either equivalent to or less than what Miriam Adelson did to deserve her Medal of Freedom, Presidential Medal of Freedom. Something the President of the United States alone decides to grant to a civilian. And let's just remember Sheldon Adelson, her husband, was, of course, the Las Vegas billionaire who pumped millions and millions of dollars into the Trump campaign. If I'm not mistaken, this was around the same time he gave a Medal of Freedom to Rush Limbaugh, a man sowing division in the United States long before Donald Trump was a political figure of any size. And Donald Trump has sort of picked up the Rush Limbaugh torch when it comes to driving a wedge between Americans, radicalizing our politics, and polarizing us further. Quickly, before we get started, just a couple of new polls to go. The polls are in! Do we got the polls yet? Let's see. Polls. Outward Intelligence has Harris up 6, 53-47. Emerson College, it's a +5 for Harris. Harris at 52.3. Trump at 47.7. So, there you go. That's the update for today. We're not going to spend all day today talking about polls. We have done more than enough work to prove to you that at least the momentum at this moment, and all of the swing state polls, with the exception of Nevada, which has now been changed by the Cook Political Report from lean Republican past toss-up to lean Democrat, because Senator Jackie Rosen has been ahead this entire time, including the time in which Biden was still atop the ticket. Perhaps there were some hopes in states like Nevada and Arizona that Biden might have been bolstered by those Senate candidates, but that's technically not the way it's supposed to work. Most of the money is raised by the presidential candidate, and therefore that candidate is supposed to offer coattails to people in Congress, people running for the United States Senate, and not the other way around. Well, as we just heard Donald Trump denigrate not only the U.S. military, but U.S. Medal of Honor recipients, saying that what Miriam Adelson did, which was marry a billionaire casino owner, sort of like Melania or Marla Maples, or Ivanka, or Ivana, rather. Do it for the money, I guess. Well, and that's all one need have on her resume to get a Presidential Medal of Freedom. Again, nothing is sacred to this man, including the records of our men and women in uniform. Let's not forget that it was Chris LaCivita, a chief official with the Trump campaign, who launched the 2004 Swift Boat campaign against John Kerry. I remember that clearly because it was the first election and presidential election in which I was eligible to vote. I had to sit by and watch Gore v. Bush happen, and watch the Supreme Court step in and decide that was enough after the state of Florida threw up all the roadblocks possible to Al Gore getting a fair election outcome in the state of Florida. The 538 hanging chads or whatever it was, that's complete nonsense. That had nothing to do with the outcome of Florida, where Jeb Bush was really able to help his brother W. This is the way they like to say it down here in the southeastern United States. And a quick reminder, for those of you who might be new to the Magnolia Media Podcast, our mission is to try and educate our neighbors here in Tennessee and Alabama and Georgia and the Carolinas, because we are in the state that many would consider the buckle of the Bible Belt, a state with several white supremacy hate groups, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. We live in a state where right to work has some appeal to everyday workers. This is a state ripe for a candidate like Donald Trump, who is selling populism and lies. These people are hungry for something other than the norm, because to them the norm has been failure, and they are always looking for a scapegoat. It actually reminds me of a short story I'll share with you. A couple days ago, while waiting in the pharmacy, our local city magazine happened to be out on the countertop. You know how magazines are spread around doctors' offices. And after flipping through this, I saw a few really high-end restaurants in the heart of the city, downtown, where people with money seem to come, have a bite to eat, look around and say, oh, isn't this quaint? And then drive 30 miles outside the city to where most of the houses were featured in the magazine. Most of the people featured in the magazine are not residents of the city, especially not the city proper. It's not as if they are pouring into apartment complexes being built downtown, even though downtown living has been open to the public since 2001, and a complete renovation of downtown began in 2009 and ended sometime in the last few years. It really is pristine, but it doesn't offer the things a normal city offers, like, a grocery store, without having to leave the always crowded downtown area and all sorts of traffic and fight your way out to a local grocery store 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 miles away, and then have to drive back into downtown just so you can say you live in downtown. That's one of the reasons this podcast is moving to the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. Well, actually, downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, after this fall. And why Pittsburgh, one might say? Well, it's like a Manhattan. It's certainly a city that's been cleaned up 1,000 times over since the 1970s and 1980s. It's a city that's, well, frankly beautiful, with the rivers running through it. It's lit up at night, and it's about half the cost of Manhattan. It's a place where I feel I can go and do some good with the podcast, speaking on behalf of liberals in the South. Now, I'm an everyday person who studied political science in college, and so is my co-host and part-time producer, Courtney Brown. We have both been sort of students of political maneuvering, of political news, world news for that matter. And we've sort of carried that into a podcast where we try to just tell the truth and an aggregate of the news from the Washington Post, the New York Times, NPR, PBS NewsHour, CNN, MSNBC, and yes, even Fox News, which I don't quote here directly very often because I really can't get through more than 5 minutes or so before I start considering the damage that network has done to the American psyche. Before Fox News sinked its teeth in to millions of Americans, pulling them into a doom loop that causes them to be angry and paranoid and hateful toward people who don't look like them, pray like them, or love like them. They feel alienated. And among especially young white men in this country, those who, well, let's face it, live a loner existence because of modern technology. The swipe left and swipe right doesn't make for a very good or healthy dating pool. I don't care how many scientists come along and do sociological research studies on these particular issues. There's no way around that not being good. So, back to the topic at hand. If we remember back to 2004, those of you old enough to remember that, John Kerry, a decorated war hero, was ripped to pieces by a plan set forth by Chris LaCivita, who worked for the George W. Bush campaign in 2004. So let's not let George W. Bush off the hook just quite yet. After all, it was his father, Herbert Walker Bush, who hired Lee Atwater. Google it if you don't know who he is, and bring a bag because you'll need somewhere to vomit. So we know Donald Trump has nothing but contempt for those who served. The fact his running mate served in the Marine Corps is really just a plus to him because in some way it might come around to help him in the end. But they have no problem whatsoever going after vice presidential candidate on the Democratic side of the ticket, Governor Tim Walz, who briefly said in a video from years ago in front of school students that there was no need for weapons of war like the ones he carried in war. Well, that's just speaking quickly. That's just trying to get the attention of children, of people who are middle school or high school aged. He probably misspoke. There's nothing he needs to defend. It's sickening. It's a huge turnoff in 2024, 20 years after the Swift Boat campaign against John Kerry, in a country that has certainly moved to the left since 2004, to go after one's military service. Especially when the man atop the ticket, Donald Trump, got out of Vietnam 5 times for bone spurs that didn't exist. Because as soon as he was no longer eligible for the draft, the bone spurs just disappeared. And really, what type of supreme bloodline could you possibly have if you were experiencing bone spurs in your feet and ankles at 18, 19, 20, 21, 22? I wouldn't say that you were came from a perfect genetic background, especially when you take a look at Fred Trump and Donald Trump's mother. As they aged, they got more and more grotesque. And yes, I came right out and said it. So I assume CNN and others have decided to, let Trump be Trump and show it to the American public. I find it to be incredibly irresponsible. CNN and most of the legacy media has once again dropped the ball. They platformed Trump in what the Trump called a, quote, press conference. CNN has apparently learned nothing from the last 9 years of having this psychopathic asshole on the scene about how to cover him. You record. Then you're able to dissect the tape and have your hosts walk people through it. If CNN still thinks they're making a play for the people in the middle or on the right of the American political spectrum, they are, well, completely and frankly out of their mind. Their only true competitor in news at this point, at least when it comes to viewers and talent moving from spot to spot, is MSNBC. CNN and MSNBC are linked as two of the three cable news channels that are considered to be, quote, liberal, but they are in no way liberal. They are, however, corporate. I ask you this simple question, MSNBC viewers. How many of your daily hosts and your weekend hosts, because we're talking about Michael Steele here as well, were once repulsive Republicans? And I don't mean just low-ranking Republicans. I'm talking about things like Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele, or congressmen who carried water for the 2000 Bush campaign while they worked tirelessly to steal an election from Al Gore. Well, he's the star of MSNBC, of course, Joe Scarborough. And Morning Joe, a man who can't help but marry his co-hosts. So perhaps CNN are just hedging their position in case Trump does win. And then they'd have perhaps a better case to avoid the, internment camps where Trump has promised to send those liberal elites with which he disagrees so vehemently and feels that they need to be psychologically retrained. This doomsday 1984 outlook on the world sends shivers up everyone's spine. I actually think I just decided that perhaps that should be the theme music for Project 2025, just in case it's ever turned into a movie or mini-series on Netflix or some other streaming platform. But CNN and other rapidly failing network news, MSNBC talking to you, and Fox News, which will be on the block eventually despite having sort of 2.5 million people who will tune in to their primetime programming no matter what, because they're going to have their bubble burst in this election if we do our jobs and get out to the polls. Tell friends. Be sure and turn them on to a Kamala Harris campaign rally. And they can experience the joy. They can experience the bolt of electricity running through the audience themselves. They don't have to take your word for it. You don't have to be the soothsayer. You just have to carry the message. Maybe even consider volunteering, phone banking. Or do what I did and start a podcast and see if you can't get your voice out there. Pound it home every day on your Instagram or whatever social media platform you choose to use. And make sure people know, especially people who know you, that you feel this way, that you want a better future for America, a progressive tax code for those billionaires and centimillionaires worth 300, 400, 500 million, or in some cases worth 100 to 200 billion. There's no way that that's not exceeding some hypothetical maximum income. But I digress. Again, talking about these news networks and how they have to approach Donald Trump. You have to film his speech break it down using editors and producers and reporters, deciding what needs to be flagged before a viewer gets a chance to see it. Because again, peeling these people away from OANN or Newsmax or whatever the hell they might be watching is going to be, well, impossible. They will never trust you, CNN or MSNBC. Furthermore, if you want to last longer, it's time to adopt a different business model. No one who reads the news for a living on a cable station is worth $30 million. They just aren't, especially if that person was wealthy before you started paying them that much money. And I know that's not everyone. I know Rachel Maddow, for example, was not a rich person before becoming rich by hosting probably the best show on all of cable news. Rachel Maddow's show is truly that good, and in the long term probably keeps MSNBC on the air, because NBC would love nothing more, from what I understand, than to kill off its little sister station that it carries on cable, because, well, NBC hemorrhages money, as do all of the legacy television networks these days. So, how did things go? What do they hope to achieve? Keeping Anderson Cooper out of the gulag that Donald Trump intends to build? Or they can find some way to stroke his, hurt ego, his fragile ego. And perhaps they can avoid imprisonment that way. And they know there'll be no real consequence from Democrats. Democrats won't stop going on CNN or MSNBC. It's not like the liberal left is going to say, look, if you platform this guy, then you sacrifice all of us, the people your listeners and viewers really want to see. Because I'm sure AOC draws a bigger crowd to MSNBC or Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi than does Donald Trump, because Donald Trump nauseates normal Americans. Because just like Tim Walz said, they are weird. However, at the not a press conference with selective media in attendance only, Trump went on forever and ever. And it was just a regurgitation of what Trump says each time he has given the opportunity. He hurls insults, tries out new nicknames for VP Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. By the way, none of those embarrassing attempts at labeling the vice president have worked, as she continues to beat him like a drum. In fact, just under a month of becoming the new nominee, Harris was beginning to match and even surpass the numbers Joe Biden was putting up at this time in 2020. At his very best, Joe Biden was at 7%. We've only been in this for 4 weeks with Kamala Harris, and it's not a real leap to say that polls might start showing her up 7 or 8 or even 9 points in important swing states and across the country in a head-to-head matchup within, well, the next round of polling, which will likely come out on Sunday and another round on Monday, breaking down registered voters and likely voters. I always sort of lean toward the polls with likely voters, which I think are perhaps projected to be closer than they really are, because polling companies make for two things: lazy journalism, because then you have journalists writing stories about a poll when people can deduce what's in that poll without you having to write a 3,000-word article to go along with it. And even when you do, New York Times and Washington Post, you miss the point entirely, usually burying what should be the headline 20 paragraphs in. So, at this point, Biden was hanging in there at about 7 points. At about 7 points. But I don't remember at any point in the 2020 campaign when he broke into the margin of error in the polls in both Texas and Florida. Yes, Texas and Florida. I know Democrats are tired of hearing about Texas because every cycle it's supposed to be getting closer and closer and closer. But we have an excellent Senate candidate in Colin Allred in the state of Texas taking on the least popular senator in the United States. In fact, one might even say he's hated by the American public at large. He's even disliked by a large number of his own in the GOP, or what used to be the GOP and Republican Party, and is now just a MAGA troll party, or a maggot party, if you just go with the MAGAT, since everything has to be an acronym with these people, or they don't seem to understand it. Donald Trump carries on and on with his politics of grievance. He, after all, is the one who is so unlucky. He is the one all of these sins have been committed against. Of course, there was the assassination attempt, which he said he'd never talk about again, and then continues to talk about it in every single, quote, press conference. Not a press conference, just an opportunity for him to get up there and spout off at the mouth for 90 minutes while no one checked him and no one asked a serious question because those people were locked out of the room. Like I said, it usually lasts about an hour, hour and a half. And he carries on with the American sucks nonsense. Same thing a con man would do when he was looking for new ways to griff off his supporters. See above. Oh, and by the way, have we been paying attention to DJT Media, which was all the hype a few months ago when it went public with the most outrageous valuation in the history of stocks? It's still valued at, $6 billion, despite the fact the bottom has fallen out of it. The stock opened at $70 a share and is now down into the low 20s. And it seems to be a number that reflects the odds of him being elected president of the United States. Either way, people who bought into this stock are going to get hurt. The same way people who work hourly jobs are being grifted on to give $10, $20, $30, $100, or pay $400 for some really, really crappy gold shoes, or the fight assassination attempt version of the sneakers. I think you can get those for $2.99. Trump and whoever's voluntarily making these sneakers for him probably paid 90 cents to have those junky things put together. And now that Trump's back on Twitter X, that's another reason to stay away from DJT Media. Stay away from it. There's your financial advice. That's the closest thing I'll ever give to a stock tip. Stay away from a meme stock that is currently in free fall. I don't expect this stock to be worth more than $10 in another 6 months, especially if things continue the way they're going and Trump completely blows up the election for Republicans. An election that they could have won. If they had nominated Nikki Haley, they would be in the driver's seat in this whole thing. And that's not to say that Donald Trump isn't. It's just to say that, well, they're awful. There are no two ways about it. With this particular crew of people who are willing to castrate themselves, debauch themselves in front of the whole world to appease one man, to go on cable news and deflect from every question asked, I mean, they managed to run our moderate conservative senators out of the United States Senate here in Tennessee. No more Lamar Alexanders, no more people who have his general temperament, like Bob Corker. Instead, we have Bill Hagerty, a MAGA senator, and we have Marsha Blackburn, a MAGA senator. And come 2025, when it's time to vote to certify the election, I guarantee you those are two people who will not do it. Those are two people who will attempt to subvert our democracy again, unless, of course, Donald Trump wins. As we prepare for the Democratic Party convention, Democrats will have another moment in which they'll capture even more momentum. This will leave Trump enraged. You already know that. Some speaker is sure to give a speech that will be remembered for the next 50 years, especially again if Kamala is elected. We should know that Trump and his flailing campaign are going to try to steal the news cycle every day of the Democratic National Convention. But it's an opportunity for Democrats to coalesce around Kamala Harris, to see those numbers go from 90% to 95 or 97 or 98% of Democrats being satisfied and committing to voting and committing to help get others to vote in this year's election and stop Donald Trump in his tracks once again. After all, Peter Baker of the New York Times, he is now the oldest man to ever run for president of the United States, has one verbal slip after another, has days where he just simply does not look healthy at all, and part of that is that they put on the Rust-Oleum number 45 a little too heavy. If it wasn't for his giant belly, you'd say his cheeks were sunken in, and he looked to be a complete mess, which he does. But Peter Baker's not writing 3 articles a week about it anymore. And why? Why, Peter? There are plenty of people at the New York Times to write sunny articles about Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, or to go through her history as a prosecutor, attorney general, senator, and vice president to see if they can dig up something that might be salacious. Your job, I thought, was to be the pit bull hitman for the Salzberger family. I mean, you show your face on TV, which I would hide if I were 5'2", 105 pounds, and literally looked like the definition of Poindexter. And that's not just, cutting into your looks. The simple fact of the matter is, I've never seen a journalist at what's supposed to be a legitimate, mainstream, reliable newspaper spend so much of his time attacking one candidate and holding the other to a completely different standard. Joe Biden has been held to a standard, a double standard, unlike any other in political history. It's just that simple. And Peter Baker and Ezra Klein, I suppose, were the two, both New York Times employees, who spent what seemed to be a full-time job just attacking the President of the United States because he speaks a little slower, because he's a little more thoughtful. Well, I think we've been damn fortunate to have him over the last 3.5 years, considering there's war in the Middle East, there's war in Eastern Europe, which the Ukrainians are now advancing into Russia, causing Russia, who, losing a lot of troops themselves, to have to pull out of parts of Ukraine to go try and stop the Ukrainians from pushing any closer to Moscow. I mean, another 6 months of this and they'll be in Moscow. If we're sure to elect Kamala Harris president, there will be no gap in funding to the Ukrainians, and we might actually defang Russia altogether as a global military power. Because at the moment, it looks like an army, mostly an army of men, not an army of drones or sophisticated weapons, attempting to take out a country that is sort of having to learn on the fly, and the average age of a soldier on the front line serving for the Ukraine is 40, as they don't want to lose too many young men who can help repopulate the nation. Because one day this war will be over. As Winston Churchill said, like all things, this too shall pass. So, given what Joe Biden did for this country by stepping aside and allowing Kamala Harris to take over, we owe him even more. After passing all of those rescue plans, after passing the infrastructure bill, after passing the CHIPS and Science Act, after passing the PACT Act to help get soldiers and first responders to 9/11 the extra health care they need, after lowering the cost of prescription drugs for seniors, allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices for the first time in history. There'll come a time when there's a program out there that you use. You might not realize at the moment that it's only there because of Joseph Robinette Biden and his one term in office. But that's why we should stop and thank him now. The expansion of health care, making it easier and easier to get health insurance on the ACA website. That's how I'm insured. 45 million Americans will lose their health insurance if Donald Trump is elected president. It's just that simple. Every woman in the country will be at risk of being put on some sort of a monitor so that data can be sent back to the federal government about when they have their menstrual cycle. That's just plain psychopathic. Again, on the subject of VP picks, we should congratulate Harris for her pick of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, the man who returned joy to politics in the United States and a man who will be a great candidate in 8 years for President of the United States. A man who's being attacked for not owning any stock. Well, I thought it was corrupt for politicians to own stock. Didn't they say that about Nancy? Yeah, they said that about Nancy. They said it. Yeah, especially after, some sketchy trades were made. But there's nothing illegal about that. Members of Congress can trade stock, and I guess they can even do so when they have incredible insider information about what's about to happen with one company or the other, giving them the opportunity to make millions of dollars in the market, even if they just start by using their tax-free $177,000 a year salary that comes with perks and benefits of all different kinds based on committee assignments, etc., etc. A man like Tim Walz can quickly become a dad or uncle to so many of us who wish we'd had a dad or an uncle like Tim Walz growing up. Governor Walz spent his free time, as did I, in the summers, working for his grandparents on the farm in Nebraska. Grew up in a town of about 400. The first school I attended was kindergarten through 5th grade here in Tennessee. We had a total of, drum roll, 89 students. 89. From kindergarten to 5th grade. In 6 grades, in 6 different classes, we had fewer than 100 students every year I was at that little school. So, he loves to go to those fairs, just like we did when I was growing up. And at those fairs, they grade everything from the best pumpkin to the best walking horses and everything in between. Awards are given away by livestock experts. Walz has also managed to label Trump and Vance as weird. A simple name like Weird, and that nickname seems to have stuck to a truly weird pair in Trump and Vance. And they are weird. Look at what Trump considers to be luxurious and stylish. It's just gold-plated everything. It's as if, some I don't know, like Fran Drescher became a billionaire and was able to just make everything gold and shiny. That's the way that the Trump family duplex atop Trump Tower looks. That's the same issue with Mar-a-Lago and the same gaudy nastiness of his private plane, which is a 2001 737, not some Lear private jet, something sleek, something sexy, something you see a successful actor or a successful millionaire flying around the world in. He basically pulled his plane off the trash heap and had some upgrades done. So, Trump, who's rattled, doesn't know what to do, is obviously sick, is obviously on some sort of a blood thinner, given the way he bled when his ear was just slightly nicked with a piece of glass or plastic or whatever the debris was. However, blood ran down his face, leading one to believe he's got some health issues he's not disclosing to the American people. And in less than a month, Trump will be sentenced for the 34 criminal convictions he has in the state of New York. And he will likely have to wear an ankle monitor on the stage in front of the entire country while debating a prosecutor and former attorney general of the state of California. The contrast will be stark, to say the least. Imagine how quick Kamala Harris will be to respond to the questions at hand, to the things of substance, not to the bait being put out there by a man who can do nothing but lie, a compulsive liar who knows how to throw people off balance, knows how to get under people's skin. He'll do everything short of calling her the N-word. And I wouldn't be surprised if things get dark enough for Donald Trump, knowing that if he loses this election, he will die in prison. The Miami case, the Florida documents case, will be started up again, this time under a new judge, because Eileen Cannon was really just throwing a Hail Mary by dismissing that on unconstitutional grounds by saying Jack Smith was not a legitimate special prosecutor, and it took her this long to come up with that. It took this long for her to decide that because he wasn't appointed by the United States Senate, he didn't have the right. Well, that vacates everybody who's been charged by a special prosecutor. If the Attorney General himself needs to take this case, then that's what needs to happen. And another thing, I hope to goodness that if she wins and when she wins, Kamala Harris changes just a few things about the Biden administration and starts with this spineless Attorney General, Merrick Garland. I do wish Merrick Garland had gotten a seat on the Supreme Court, although I'm not really sure how he would have voted. I do wish Merrick Garland had gotten that opportunity so we wouldn't be staring down the barrel of a 6-3 Supreme Court that can afford to lose a vote and still overrule the Chief Justice or Amy Coney Barrett, the two who seem most likely to part from the dogma of Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, who really run this out of control, illegitimate, unconstitutional, neo-Christian, white fascists at the Supreme Court. It's just that simple. Look at the rulings. They're choosing religion over the individual every time because they feel like it's their job in life to impose their religious beliefs on everyone else. So, one more time, we'll go over what's going on in the polls. Just one more little point about the polls. In 538's poll of polls, Harris now leads by a full 3%. I mentioned the poll from Outward Intelligence. Harris leads by 6 in a 4-way race. Speaking of other candidates who are running to pay off tax debt, like Cornel West, RFK Jr. has now offered both Trump and Harris his endorsement. Yes, his endorsement's for sale because he's a man of character. In exchange for a job inside their administration, because he's not employable. The brainworm, the brain wave from 2012. He's had a worm in his brain eating away. Well, I'd say it's starving at this point for the last 12 years. No, actually, the brainworm's dead. He does not have an active brainworm from what we understand. But he did say he can't practice law anymore, so I'm not exactly sure what he's been doing all this time other than blowing his inheritance. We're talking about a Kennedy inheritance here, so it's not a small amount of money. And perhaps both sort of ignored him altogether. I'm not sure exactly how the Trump camp handled it, but I know Kamala Harris refused to even consider this ridiculous situation because he's taking votes from Donald Trump almost exclusively. And he's managed to get himself on ballots throughout the country, especially focusing on swing states. Let him go ahead and do that so that voters who, especially those who aren't really plugged in, who are not plugged in to the extent where they would vote for RFK Jr. so that his name's on the ballot and that person could say, well, I'm not voting for Trump, I'm voting for RFK Jr. That way I don't have to deal with all the things I don't like about Trump. And I get someone, almost as bad. At least as far as we know, he's... never mind. Moving on. And then, of course, there is the story of the bear cub. I won't go into it in detail here because, to be completely honest, it gets me enraged. It makes me like Bobby Kennedy even less, as if that were possible. About the bear cub, left in Central Park by the very sick man who is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And perhaps that's why he was completely brushed off by even the Trump administration. Brushed off by even the Trump administration? When you could deliver him, maybe a few votes, maybe you could lend him a hand with his campaign in some way, maybe bring money in because of his wealthy ex-wife of a Silicon Valley billionaire who's funding his campaign. I don't know. There seems, at least to Trump, to be a lot of plus side to having Bobby Kennedy Jr. working in his campaign and in his administration if he were to win. But I don't think anyone likes the idea of a bear cub being stabbed to death. It had nothing to do with a car. We know that now. A car may have hit it afterward. But the cause of death was determined to be stab wounds. My question is, where was Mama Bear? And could she not have gotten to Bobby Kennedy in time while he was stabbing this bear to death? One more big piece of news about Kamala Harris. It's very, very difficult in today's political climate for a politician running for president or one who's already in an administration to have a positive approval rating. 44, 45 would be good, but at this current moment, Kamala Harris is approaching the high water mark reached by Joe Biden in 2020 and looks to surpass it. She has to remember that Biden didn't win by the 7% predicted by polls and instead won by about 3.5%. Still, she has all the important momentum. And, barring some awful October surprise, and the vow taken by the Trump campaign officials that the race won't be over until in November if Trump doesn't win. Trump chief campaign strategist Chris LaCivita said last month at an event with Politico that this thing won't be over until she puts her hand on the Bible at the inauguration. So they're talking about scheming against the United States of America after January 6th. Sure, if Kamala Harris wins, there'll be an attack on the Capitol on January 6th, but it won't get anywhere because barriers would have been erected. And there will be military everywhere to make sure that, well, there's not a repeat of 2021. They'll make sure that instead of one dead person, if necessary, and they decide to charge with batons, with American flags, with pepper spray, that people will get killed. Especially if there's, say, 5,000 National Guard members called in by Maryland and Virginia, called in by the President of the United States, Joe Biden, on that day. There will not be a repeat of January 6th. So they'll come up with another, more insidious plan to try to undermine the election. And that's what Chris LaCivita, a man who has run many campaigns, who has won and lost many campaigns, to come out and say something like that is so irresponsible. And to actually be brainstorming about how to pull it off is even more insidious and disgusting. Chris LaCivita, you should be ashamed of yourself. You've been around. You know how politics works. You've been in D.C. for, well, forever. And now that you're 1,000,000 years old, you've decided a coup d'etat is in order. Chris LaCivita's only comment about what would happen if Trump loses on election night or the day after that, and that is that he would reach out to the Harris campaign to wish them good luck over the next 4 years, because as the president goes, the country goes. So shame on him. Shame on him for saying that. But we'll leave today's podcast on a high note, talking about Governor Tim Walz, talking about a football coach who the season before he started coaching the high school football team, they won exactly no games. They went 0 for 10, 11, 12, whatever. The next year, they won the state championship in Minnesota. A man who served 24 years in the National Guard was about to retire after 20 years, where he would get his full pension and insurance benefits and all that, and instead decided to stay for 4 more years because September 11th happened. In 2005, after being a teacher, using the GI Bill to go to college, then becoming a teacher, serving his community, a politician who doesn't own stock, by the way, so there'll be no conflict of interest there. A man who was thought of highly by his students across the board. If not, they would have already found those students and, been out bashing him. Who moved from the farm in Nebraska, in a town of about 400, to southern Minnesota, where he has spent his career, his life, and where he's had his children, who were born using IVF, in vitro fertilization, the miracle of modern science that allows couples that have issues with fertility to have children. That is something that would be banned according to Project 2025, buried in that 900 and whatever pages of dystopian Christo-fascist takeover of the United States. The blueprint is Project 2025. Walz immediately showed what type of boisterous and happy guy he was. A man who looks like he's just happy to be there. And a man with governing experience that gives us the comfort of knowing if, God forbid, something were to happen to a future President Kamala Harris, he would be ready to step right in on day one. Even if she has to have a minor operation of some kind that requires her to be under anesthetic, he would be President of the United States for that day, or until she recovered from her procedure. And approaching age 60, who knows? There might be something that pops up. Nothing serious, but something that pops up. And I feel very confident and happy that this is the guy. Josh Shapiro certainly doesn't give you that instant warm feeling that Tim Walz gives a person. A lot of Republicans I know here in Tennessee are now going to vote for the Democratic ticket because of the addition of Tim Walz. They weren't crazy about Kamala Harris, and given an option like a ticket with Tim Walz on it or a ticket with shady J.D. Vance, if that's the name he's using this week. After all, he has 3. I would assume at some point his name will be J.D. Teal. That was a joke in poor taste. I sort of take that one back. No, I don't. What am I saying? I don't give a darn. Anyway, if you enjoyed today's podcast, we are the Magnolia Media Podcast. We are from Knoxville, Tennessee. And as far as I know, we are the only liberal, regular folks bringing you an aggregate of the news that affects us here in the South and that moves progressive and liberal values forward into the 21st century, even in a place like the Bible Belt Buckle and East Tennessee. We appreciate you tuning in. If you enjoy our content, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/the Magnolia Media Network. And you can get this all audio podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also, my Instagram page is a direct link to this podcast. We discuss politics, pop culture, movies of the night. Movies of the night. It sounds like movies that are prostitutes. Well, a film of the evening, I should say. And then we talk about it on IG Lives. I try to do one every day. I have definitely fallen behind on that because we had issues with our software last week and I couldn't do the podcast anyway. Sort of took a little time off in the middle of election season. Again, please forward this to a friend if you've enjoyed our podcast. If you would like to see us stay on the air, again, please consider giving $5 at patreon.com/the Magnolia Media Network. Again, I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. Until next time, be well, won't you?